Yá'át'ééh, Bina, or Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. It's not morning anymore, although maybe on the West Coast it actually is. But it is very good to be with you. Today is Monday, February 21st, which is President's Day 2022. And I am sitting down with my second cup of coffee. And I'm going to be giving a special edition of my second cup of coffee today, talking about the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln. Most people don't know that Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist, by his own admission, and one of the most genocidal presidents in U.S. history. And yet we honor him as one of our greatest presidents. This is a severe problem. And so I'm going to be talking about this today. I'm going to be laying out my argument of why he is a blatant white supremacist as well as a genocidal president. And I hope by the end of this presentation, which will run about 45 minutes to an hour, that you will be convinced and you will agree with me and you will be willing to work with me to help change what we view, how we view ourselves as a nation, what we celebrate, and even what we honor. But before I begin, I want to do as I always do. I want to start by acknowledging the land that I'm on. So I moved with my family from Washington, D.C., or from the Navajo Nation about 7 years ago to Washington, D.C. And these lands are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. The Piscataway, they're the nation that they were living here, hunting here, farming here, fishing here, raising their families here, and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And they are still here. So I want to honor the Piscataway as the host people of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. Yá'át'ééh, my Piscataway relatives, I honor you today. Over the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'm going to be talking to you about Abraham Lincoln. And a lot of the content, not all of it, is included in chapter 4 of the book that I co-authored, which is Unsettling Truths. Not chapter 4, chapters 9 and 10. And so I'm going to actually share a link. If you're interested in purchasing a signed copy of that book, you can get that on my website. But I'm going to be covering a lot of the content that's in chapters 9 and 10. But if you want to see how Abraham Lincoln actually fits into the longer narrative and history of our nation, I highly encourage you to look at the book and to read it if you're able to. Most people know and acknowledge that our nation has a troubled history. It was just over the weekend that Deb Haaland, who the first Native American cabinet secretary, she's the Secretary of the Interior. She actually did a fairly public acknowledgement of the atrocity of internment camps, and lamented and even grieved that part of our history. And of course, it was just 2 days ago, February 19, that President Truman signed the order to put up to 10,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps at the start of World War II. And this is a horrible piece of our legacy. And I was very grateful to Deb Haaland, not only for her acknowledgement of that atrocity, but for her statement that as the Secretary of the Interior and the Department of the Interior, one of its jobs is to honor our nation, or to acknowledge our nation's history, to honor those who were wronged, and to work to tell a much more accurate history of our country. And I looked on both, as well as Vice President Harris's Twitter account, as well as Joe Biden's Twitter account. And they both also had this same acknowledgement about the atrocity of World War II, the horrors of the internment camps, and they had those posted on their Twitter accounts, which I was very grateful for. However, when I was checking all of those same Twitter accounts, I noticed that none of them today were calling out the atrocities of one of the presidents who we honor on President's Day, which is that of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm disappointed by that. I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed by it because we have to learn how to teach our history. You see, one of the challenges we have as Americans is that history is written by the victors. And a challenge America faces, the United States of America faces, is that we've never lost a war that matters, right? Every major military conflict we've been involved in, we've won. We've had a few minor mishaps, a few wars that didn't go quite the way we wanted to. We pulled out of them rather quietly, whether it was Afghanistan or whether it was Vietnam. The Korean War technically never ended. Or we changed the narrative as we did with the bombings of our air bases in the Philippines and other places around the country, around the world, which were hit soon after Pearl Harbor. And some of them even fell. We lost them. But we changed the narrative so that we only focused on Pearl Harbor and kind of forgot about the rest of those. And so the challenge we face as a country is we've never lost a war that matters. We've never had to have our homeland invaded. We've never were disarmed. We never had to face the scorn of the global community. We've won every major war we've been involved in, and as a result, we have written our own history since our founding. And this is a problem because when you have that much power and when you have that ability, your history very quickly becomes mythological. I want to just ask you to imagine for a moment, what do you think the history books would look like had Nazi Germany won World War II? How would the history of the world read? Right? How would Adolf Hitler be portrayed had Nazi Germany won World War II? Well, Adolf Hitler would be portrayed as the greatest leader of Germany ever, right? And the Holocaust, well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust. Unfortunately, this is exactly what we did as a nation in the United States. Because we've won our wars, we've been able to change the narrative and write our own story without the edits from the global community. And one of the consequences of that is that as a nation, we don't have a clue who Abraham Lincoln is. So I want to actually start by asking you a question. And I'm going to share my screen here. So I'm going to go into a smaller screen below, and I'm going to put my screen up here. But actually, let me go up. So I want you to think about the major conflicts and some of the deadliest days in world history. Not aside from natural disasters, what are some of the deadliest days in global history? Do you have some ideas in mind? When I ask this in public sessions or in in-person events, I often hear people bring up very quickly Hiroshima or Nagasaki, right? The two nuclear bombs that we dropped on Japan to end World War II. Now, those were in the top 10 of some of the deadliest days in global military history, but they weren't at the top. The top was actually Operation Meeting House. You see, Hiroshima had 60,000 deaths. Nagasaki had 40,000 deaths. Operation Meeting House had more than 100,000 deaths. Now, maybe you're asking, what is Operation Meeting House? Well, Operation Meeting House was the incendiary bombing of Tokyo, which happened prior to us dropping the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We actually chose Tokyo as a target because we knew it was a wooden city and would burn hotter. And it's actually hard to get an accurate count because the city was bombed so extensively and burned so hot. It was often hard to tell the remains of those who died. And so the best estimates coming out of the US are about 100,000 people. Of course, other estimates by other nations are higher, but because we won the war, we wrote the history, people generally go with the 100,000 estimate. Now, this might surprise you, but again, this is just proof. Why don't we know this as Americans? Well, it's because we've never lost a war. We won World War II. We wrote the history of World War II. As a result, we don't teach things like Operation Meeting House. In my book, when we introduce these two chapters on Abraham Lincoln, we talk about two characters. This is in chapter 9. We talk about Oscar Groening and Robert McNamara. Oscar Groening was, he served as a guard in some of the death camps in Germany. He wasn't the one gassing people, but he was the one in charge of counting the items that were taken from the Jewish people, taking an accounting of what was acquired, and then giving that up. And as he went through his work and his jobs, he knew what was going on in the camp, and he sometimes saw what was happening, but he wasn't the one in charge of killing people. He actually requested for a transfer, and wasn't until much later that he got it. And then, actually, I think he didn't get it, but he was captured eventually and ended the war in a prison camp. And after the camp, he kind of just went about his life and didn't say much about what he had been involved in. And then in the 90s, when the Holocaust denial movement kind of began taking place, Oscar Groening began speaking out publicly against the deniers and telling his account of what he saw and what he knew had happened in those camps. And after one such interview where he went into detail about that experience, he was arrested. And he was charged with accomplice to hundreds of thousands, 300,000 murders. He was tried and found guilty. And so he died waiting for he had an appeal going, and he died while he was waiting, but he died a convicted and condemned war criminal. Now, about the same time that Oscar Groening was born, Robert McNamara was born. Robert McNamara grew up in the United States, and he actually served during World War II as well, and he was an analyst for General LeMay, who was in charge of the fighting and the bombings in the Pacific Theater. And General LeMay, Robert McNamara, was in charge of analyzing the bombing raids. And as they were bombing cities throughout Japan, he noticed that they were not very accurate and concluded it was because they were flying so high and the bombs were dropping through the jet stream, and we didn't understand the jet stream very well back then, and so they were missing their targets. So he recommended that we fly our planes lower. And General LeMay took that into account, and he was actually planning not only Operation Meeting House, but also Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And as a result, Operation Meeting House was a glaring success. They were much more accurate. Hundreds of thousands of people died. When he left the military after the war was over, he was actually given an award and honored. He went on to serve as the Secretary of Defense and became one of the architects of the Vietnam War. And in Vietnam, he helped architect that war, including the use of Agent Orange. And after that service, he was given the Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor you can get as a civilian. And he's buried at Arlington, honored. And what's the difference, right, between Robert McNamara and Oscar Groening? What's the difference between them? The only difference is Oscar Groening's side lost the war and Robert McNamara's side won the war. And so Oscar Groening died a condemned war criminal, and Robert McNamara died a war hero. They both were accomplices to hundreds of thousands of deaths. But because one side won, the other side lost, one was convicted and the other was honored. That's the challenge we face when the victors write the history. Actually, I wanted to talk about this too, because there was one other, and people will say, well, what about the Holocaust? And yes, the Holocaust was absolutely atrocious. The deadliest period I could find in the Holocaust was a 3-month period called Operation Reinhard, where between September and November of 1942, 1.3 million Jewish people were killed. Now, that number is high and atrocious. The reason it wasn't on the list is because that actually averaged out to 14,000 per day. And I was asking about a 24-hour period. And so it didn't make the list. But this is absolutely a very atrocious event. So I want to acknowledge that in here. But that the reason it wasn't on the list is because it worked out to a smaller number per day than the other numbers that were above it. So the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've written our own history for 250 years. And as a result, we have no clue who Abraham Lincoln is. In fact, as race relations have gotten worse in our country over the past few decades, Abraham Lincoln's stock has actually risen. As I was reading and researching his popularity, he actually is almost by consensus from both Democrats and Republicans now considered one of the, or even the greatest president in U.S. history. Right? Republicans love to claim that they are the party of Lincoln. President Obama was sworn into office. Our nation's first black president was sworn into office on his hand on the Lincoln Bible. Right? Lincoln's monument, his memorial here in D.C. is the largest memorial in the entire city, and it's modeled after a temple in Greece. Both sides, Democrats and Republicans, love to claim and to cling to and to boast about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, what does it say? Well, it says he was the great emancipator. He was the great unifier. He won the Civil War, and he abolished slavery. These are the things we honor Abraham Lincoln for. Unfortunately, we don't know much about Abraham Lincoln, aside from the mythological legacies and histories that get taught in our classrooms and written into our history books. So I want to walk you through Abraham Lincoln's public life. I'll just take some time to walk you through Abraham Lincoln's public life. Abraham Lincoln really burst onto the national political scene in August of 1858, or in 1858 when he ran for the U.S. Senate in the state of Illinois, and he was running against Judge Stephen Douglas. Now, in this campaign, during these debates, they had what was called the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the debates between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. And the debates back then were different than the debates today. Today, they're just looking for sound bites. They're very short periods of time in which the candidates can actually speak. But back then, the debates were a series of 3 speeches. The first candidate would speak for about 20 minutes. The second candidate would come back and respond for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then the first candidate would return and give another 10 to 15-minute speech. It was a set of 3 speeches, which allowed them to go into depth about their policies and their thoughts and what they were thinking and who they were. And so early in those debates, Abraham Lincoln had to introduce himself to the nation and to the state of Illinois because he was not well known, and what was known about him was problematic. He was known as someone who was against the institution of chattel slavery. And so in August 1858, this is what he said. He said, "I will say here upon this subject that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong, having the superior position." By his own admission, Abraham Lincoln was a blatant, unapologetic white supremacists. A month later, in another debate in September, he said basically the same thing. He cleaned it up politically, but he said basically the same thing. He said, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. To applause. Now remember, he's speaking in the North. The North was supposed to be anti-slavery, pro-black. That's a lie. They were applauding his white supremacist views. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together in terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Abraham Lincoln actually made his white supremacist and racist statement stronger in this quote. What he cleaned up was he took out the name of Judge Stephen Douglas, right? He didn't want to give him any free press. So he was well aware of what he was saying and cleaned it up for his political advantage. But he sharpened his white supremacist and his racist statements. Now, Abraham Lincoln lost that election, but he went on to run for president in 1860, and he won. That campaign propelled him into the national political scene, and he won the U.S. presidency in 1860. And in his inauguration in 1861, he again, because he was the president who was against chattel slavery, he felt the need to assure the nation who he was. So in his inaugural address, he said, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the ascension of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that, and now he literally starts quoting himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the interest of slavery in the states where it already exists. Now, the morning of his inauguration, Congress was in a tizzy. Several states were threatening to or actually beginning to secede from the Union. And they wanted to make sure that they could somehow hold this nation together. In some of the early morning hours before the inauguration, the Senate passed a bill of what was called the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment was a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In the Corwin Amendment, what it said is no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. The Corwin Amendment was basically constitutionally protecting enslavement in states where it already existed. That's what the U.S. Congress was attempting to do the morning of the inauguration. So in his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln actually alluded to that amendment. And he said, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, including that of persons held to service. To avoid misconstruction of what I have said, holding such a provision to now by implied constitutional law, I have no objection to it being made express and irrevocable. During his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln stated he had no problem with constitutionally protecting the institutions of slavery in states where it already existed. So that amendment passed the Senate, and even though the president has no role in amendments except to sign it at the end, Abraham Lincoln took it upon himself to mail the amendment out to the states directly, asking for their response. Now, it never got ratified, and so this Corwin Amendment did not become our 13th Amendment. But it demonstrated that Abraham Lincoln was absolutely open to constitutionally protecting the institution of slavery within our nation. In the spring and summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed two crucial bills. The first one was called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to any American citizen who was willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. It had reached up to Omaha, Nebraska, and this would give it the land and the resources to make it all the way to the West Coast, to the Pacific Ocean. In 1862, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, during his campaign, Abraham Lincoln had promised to emancipate slaves. And Horace Greeley was waiting for that to happen. And so in 1862, he wrote a scathing op-ed calling for the immediate emancipation of people who were enslaved. Now, Abraham Lincoln actually had the Emancipation Proclamation written and was in his desk, but he was reluctant to sign it because there were 4 states in the North that had not seceded from the Union that still allowed enslavement of African people. And so rather than releasing the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln responded with a letter, and in the letter he said, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." So Abraham Lincoln's response to Horace Greeley's request to free enslaved peoples in this country was, "I don't give a damn about Black people. I'm not doing what I'm doing because I care about Black people," Abraham Lincoln said. "I'm doing what I'm doing to protect the Union. Whether Black people are enslaved is of no matter to me." Also in 1862, the Dakota had recently signed a treaty with the U.S. government. In exchange for some lands, they would be given provisions to make it through the winters in Minnesota. And in the prior winter, it had been especially harsh, and the U.S. government had not met its treaty obligations, and the Dakota people, had serious troubles. And so as they were coming into the summer and fall of 1862, they were concerned about what was going to happen the next year. Now, some of the young warriors were out, and they came upon a white settlement, and they went into the settlement and stole some eggs. While they were in the settlement, they got into a conflict with some of the settlers, and they ended up killing several of them. They went back to their people, back to their Dakota leaders. They told them what they had done, and they had a debate. Do we declare war, or what do we do? And the leaders reluctantly decide to go to war because they knew they couldn't make it through another winter without their land or their treaty obligations being met. And so they decided to go to war. So a very bloody war, lasted a little over a month, started between the Dakota people and the settlers and the U.S. government. There was a lot of death on both sides. At the end of that war, about half of the Dakotas fled north into Canada, and the other half surrendered. Those who surrendered were immediately put into military tribunals. They were now being judged by the very people they were fighting, And these trials were seen by many as a sham, right? They were in a language that the Dakota didn't speak. Witnesses were being shared. The trials lasted just a few minutes. At the end of the trials, I think it was over 400 Dakota warriors were sentenced to death. That punishment and that order to kill those many warriors got all the way up to Abraham Lincoln. Apparently, no one really wanted to take responsibility for it. Abraham Lincoln also couldn't quite stomach signing such an order. But instead of ordering retrials, he simply changed the criteria of what warranted a death sentence. He just changed the criteria. Under his new criteria, I think it was only 2 Dakota warriors were now sentenced to be killed. Well, now Abraham Lincoln was afraid that his white settlers were going to revolt, as they were already starting to do. So again, for a second time, he didn't order retrials. He changed the criteria again, and now he landed on the magic number, I think it was of 39. And so the day after Christmas, 1862, hundreds of Minnesota settlers came out and watched as the largest mass execution in the history of our nation took place, with the hanging of the Dakota 38, signed by Abraham Lincoln. In January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln did finally release the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, if you've ever read the Emancipation Proclamation, it's actually very precise where it frees enslaved peoples. They are freed in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. Missing from this list is Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These are northern states that allowed slavery. And those states, if you look at the bottom, the accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And the enslaved peoples in these 4 states didn't get their freedom until after Lincoln was assassinated. On January 29 of 1863, I'm going to read, this is from Smithsonian Magazine, an article titled "The Search is On for the Site of the Worst Indian Massacre in U.S. History." It's by Sylvia Wright. It was published May 13 of 2016. It says, in the frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Segwich, a leader among the Shoshone of Bayagowe, or Big River, in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist is no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from the hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The Army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 or more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or freeze. Historians call the Bear River Massacre of 1863 the deadliest reported attack on Native Americans by the U.S. military, worse than Sound Creek in 1864, the Marias in 1870, and Wounded Knee in 1890. 250 to 400 Shoshone men, women, and children were slaughtered on that day in 1863. Again, it's actually been called the worst Indian massacre committed by the U.S. military in our nation's history. And this was effectively the turning point in Indian-white relations in northern Utah, and resulted in the opening of more land for settlement. In February of 1863, just a few days later, with Abraham Lincoln essentially negated all of the treaties with most of the Native nations in Minnesota. This is in response to the Dakota War of 1862 and the hanging of the Dakota 38. So he invalidated all of the treaties with the Native nations in the state of Minnesota. And in March of 63, without treaty or negotiation, he ordered the removal of those nations from the Minnesota state into the Dakota territories west of Minnesota. So the people were rounded up. They were put on horses, they were put on barges, they were marched out of the state, and they were brought to a reservation that was not large enough or sustainable for them. It was a brutal removal. That removal ended in the spring or summer of 1863. In the fall, I think it was, of 1863, down in the southwest in the territory of New Mexico, General Carleton gave this order. He said, henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There can be no other talk on the subject. This paper here is the bill creating Bosque Redondo, which they called a reservation. And if you look at the bottom, it was approved on January 15, 1864 by Abraham Lincoln. So General Carleton's commanders went through the land. They went through and they rounded up the Navajo people. They chased our people throughout Yá'át'ééh, which is our land between the four sacred mountains in the southwest. In the Book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he recorded that by the middle of December, most of the weak and aged had died. There is hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol or taken captive by slave raiders. The U.S. Army went through the Navajo territories. They burned our hogans. They burned our crops. They destroyed our livestock. And they rounded us up. And they moved us down to Bosque Redondo. In total, nearly 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forcibly marched to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of our people died of starvation and exposure during the walk. And about a quarter of them died in the squalor conditions at the camp. In the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, D. Brown records, it was a wretched land, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds where soldier chiefs were always counting them and putting numbers down in little books. To shelter themselves from rain and sun, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground and cover and line them with mats and woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. Crowded together as they were, disease had begun to take a toll on the weaker ones. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult and dangerous under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act. This allocated additional land and resources. It actually gave the railroad companies the mineral rights to the land that they were putting the railroads on. This gave them a financial incentive to even work harder and faster to complete the railway. Before we can talk about the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, we have to understand the history of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. So in the 1850s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho signed a treaty with the U.S. government, essentially making most of eastern Colorado their reservation lands. During the gold rush of the 1850s, thousands of prospectors came into Colorado into search for gold in the Rocky Mountains, encroaching on the land of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. In 1864, or in the late 1860s, just before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, the U.S. government actually renegotiated a treaty with the Cheyenne and Arapaho. It reduced their reservation down to about 1/13 the size of what it was previously. On November 29, 1864, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were on their treaty lands. They were waving a white flag of surrender to show that they were there peacefully. They also waved an American flag. And A U.S. Army led by a Methodist pastor came over the hill, and he ordered all of them slaughtered. More than 250 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly elderly men, women, and children, were slaughtered that day. Colonel Covington ordered his troops to take no prisoners and to pillage and set the village ablaze. Afterwards, it was reported that the soldiers paraded the mutilated body parts of the men, women, and children through downtown Denver in celebration of their massacre. Within 2.5 to 3 years of that, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were removed from Colorado onto reservations, both north and east of there. In his annual message in 1864, his State of the Union, Abraham Lincoln stated that 1.5 million acres were entered upon under the Homestead Law, and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific state by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives assurance of success. This is a map of the country around that time period, and it shows the proposed routes of the Transcontinental Railway. The primary route was going through Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and coming out near San Francisco. There was a northern route that was going to go from Duluth, Minnesota, through North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and come out near Seattle, Washington. And there was a southern route going through the territory of New Mexico, the territory of Arizona, and coming out near Los Angeles in California. Within 2.5 years of signing the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, after the removal of the Winnebago and the Dakota from Minnesota, after the removal of the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, after the removal of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache and the Long Walk in the territory of New Mexico and Arizona, and after the Bear River Massacre of the Shoshone in Utah and Idaho, Abraham Lincoln had literally ethnically cleansed most of the primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway, making him one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. Now, Abraham Lincoln's true legacy, right? His true legacy was the 13th Amendment. Most people believe that the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. They think it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That's actually not what it says, but that's what most people think it says. The problem is we don't ever study the 13th Amendment in its context. See, to understand the 13th Amendment, you have to understand Abraham Lincoln. And to understand Abraham Lincoln's thoughts on slavery, you have to understand his words in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Yes, he was against chattel slavery. But as we already saw, he absolutely believed in the lie of white supremacy. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates in October 15 of 1858, he was asked, does the Declaration of Independence apply to the black race? And his response was, I think the authors of that notable instrument intended to include all men, but they did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all men were equal in color, size, intellect, moral development, or social capacity. Now, Abraham Lincoln is not saying some men are taller and some men are shorter. Some men get better grades and some men get worse grades. He is saying one race is superior and one race is inferior, and he has already made it crystal clear which race he believes is the superior race. He was also asked in September of 1858 about making citizens of black people. And he said, Judge Douglas has said to you that he has not been able to give from me an answer to the question of whether I am in favor of Negro citizenship. So as far as I know, the judge never asked me that question before, to applause. He shall have no occasion to ask it again, for I tell him very frankly that I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. To renewed applause. Now, my opinion is that the different states have the power to make a Negro a citizen under the Constitution of the U.S. if they choose. However, if the state of Illinois had that power, I should be opposed to the exercise of it. Cries of good, good, and applause broke out. That is all I have to say about it, said Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln, while he was against chattel slavery, he absolutely believed in the lie of white supremacy. He did not believe people of color were protected under the Declaration of Independence, and he did not believe they should be citizens of this nation and be protected by the Constitution. This is what he stated as a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Illinois in 1858. Now, it's one thing to say something boldly like that as a candidate, but when you get into the office of the president, you actually have to make these decisions. And so we have to look at, what did Abraham Lincoln do? So now President Lincoln has a dilemma. What is he going to do? Right? He wants to end chattel slavery, not because he gives a crap about black lives, but because of the way it's pitting white people against each other. So now the question is, what do we do with these unenslaved people of color who are going to be roaming around our nation? What do we do with them? How do we keep them in check? Well, Abraham Lincoln's solution to this problem was to put a clause in the 13th Amendment. What the amendment actually says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Abraham Lincoln's solution was to keep slavery legal in prison, where he already said he had no intention of making voters or jurors of African people or allowing them to hold office or to intermarry. They had no role in this society. They would have no role in deciding who was convicted and who wasn't. And so his solution was, let's keep enslavement legal in prison. So a white police officer, a white jury, a white judge on a whim can incarcerate black people. This was his solution. And I think, I'm positive Abraham Lincoln would be extremely proud of what both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton did with his amendment when they were in office. Right? Ronald Reagan declared a war on drugs, which anyone who knew anything understood and saw clearly this was not a war on drugs, this was a war on race. And Bill Clinton fine-tuned that war on race through the criminal justice system and built this massive system of incarceration of people of color. I'm sure Abraham Lincoln would have been tickled with the unease and uncertainty and fear that people of color had in his nation, which he always intended to be white supremacists. So what about this list of why we think he's a great president? Right? Abraham Lincoln is not the great emancipator. Let's stop kidding ourselves. He is not the great emancipator. He was a unifier, not of the nation, but of white people. He was about trying to get white people who disagreed about the institution of chattel slavery, but agreed about the system of white supremacy. He was trying to find a way to unify that. And he did it quite successfully. We credit Abraham Lincoln with winning the Civil War. I would argue the war he actually won was the War of Manifest Destiny. In regards to the Civil War, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln was asking a question. He said, "What is it that we hold most dear amongst us?" Speaking to his white supremacist audience in front of him. "Our own liberty and prosperity. What has ever threatened our liberty and prosperity, save and accept this institution of slavery?" See, Abraham Lincoln was not first and foremost afraid that enslaved people were going to rise up and free themselves. Nor was he first and foremost concerned that someone else was going to come in, another nation come in and free the enslaved peoples in the Americas. His biggest concern was that the white supremacist people on both sides of the argument of chattel slavery were going to end up killing each other because they couldn't decide what to do with their enslaved peoples. That was what he saw as the greatest challenge and the greatest threat to this white supremacist nation that Abraham Lincoln envisioned and was working very much to bring together. So he didn't win the Civil War. He won the Civil War, but that's not the main war. The main war he won is the War of Manifest Destiny, right? Imagine what his legacy would have been had he won the Civil War, but not been able to ethnically cleanse the Cheyenne and Arapaho from Colorado, the Shoshone from Utah and Idaho, the Dakota and other nations, Winnebago from the state of Minnesota, and the Navajo, Mescalero, Apache from the territory of New Mexico and Arizona. I would imagine his legacy would be pretty low had he not been able to do that. And then let's be honest, right? Abraham Lincoln didn't abolish slavery. Read the 13th Amendment. It does not abolish slavery. It redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Abraham Lincoln constitutionally protected slavery and institutions of white supremacy. So this is his legacy. He's not the great emancipator. He's the unifier of white people. He won the War of Manifest Destiny, and he protected and institutionalized white supremacy, giving us the tools we're literally using today to keep people of color at bay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about his ethnic cleansing numbers. So Native Americans weren't actually counted in the census until the 1860s and 70s. We weren't even counted before that. In 1860, it was recorded that there were 44,000 Native peoples living within the United States. Now, these weren't what they referred to as the savage Indians living on the frontiers. These were the people who were, quote unquote, civilized, living within their cities and their states. So in 1860, their first count, they found 44,000. 1870, they found 25,000. If you're doing the math, that's a decrease of 41.56%. If you're comparing that math to Nazi Germany, they had a rate of 35.29%. And this, again, isn't even counting the number of people that Abraham Lincoln slaughtered in the massacres that he fought throughout his term in office. So this comparison is actually not shocking, right? Abraham Lincoln's vile legacy, his white supremacist language, his ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies, they are actually not that dissimilar from Adolf Hitler. This comparison is not overly shocking. There's another comparison that's even more shocking, and to do that, we have to look at the broader context. I want to look at population growth from the 1500s to the 1900s. In the 1500s, the world population was about 480 million. In the 1900s, it was 1.6 billion. That's a 3.39% rate of growth. Europe went from 82 million to 300 million for a 3.65 rate of growth. Africa, even with the horrors of the slave trade, grew from 63 million to 123 million for a 1.782 rate of growth. The USA, continental United States, went from 0 humans, according to Christopher Columbus, to 76.2 million people. And the native population plummeted. And 4 million is a very conservative, a very low number. Probably more like 6, 8, 9, maybe even higher. We'll say 4 million to 237,000. That was the lowest estimate. Remember, the 27,000 or 25,000 was just citizens. 237,000, that was an estimate in 1870. That's a 0.0593% rate of growth, which is actually a rate of death. So the War of Manifest Destiny had a 94.07% rate of genocide. This is higher than the Rwanda genocide. This is higher than the Nazi Germany genocide. This is higher than the genocide of just the decade when Abraham Lincoln was president. This is higher than the 19th century. It's one of the most complete genocides in the history of the world. So this is the nauseating comparison. Yes, Abraham Lincoln is not dissimilar. It's actually quite similar to Adolf Hitler. And the USA is not much different than Nazi Germany. Now I can guess you're getting a little prickled about that, right? Because Nazi Germany are the villains of the globe. They are the one overwhelming consensus example of a bad demographic, or a bad group of people, a bad criminal, ethnic cleansing, genocidal nation. How could we possibly compare the United States of America to Nazi Germany? Well, I already gave you the numbers. But again, let's look at it in broader context. So in 1851, Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California, in his State of the State address, January 6 of 1851, he said this: that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. He is not saying famine's broken out and we can't feed these people, nor is he saying disease has struck and we can't stop it. He's literally saying we cannot stop killing these people until we complete our manifest destiny. Robert McNamara, who I spoke about at the beginning of this presentation, towards the end of his life, he was contemplating what he had done and what he had been involved in. And he was in a documentary called The Fog of War. In this documentary, Robert McNamara wrestles with the morality of his recommendations regarding bombing Japan when he served as an analyst under General LeMay. And this is what he said. This is a quote from the documentary. He said, the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with the rules of war. Was there a rule that said you shouldn't burn to death 100,000 civilians at night? Pause. General LeMay said to us, if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he was right. We, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, Medal of Honor recipient, World War II veteran, at the end of his life, admitted that in service to his country and at the request of his country, he acted as a war criminal. And the only reason he was not condemned and convicted for that is because his nation won the wars it fought. I also want to think about Thanksgiving. Right? This is national holiday. It was Abraham Lincoln who worked hard and brought Thanksgiving into kind of its modern era. He had two proclamations, Thanksgiving Day proclamations, one in 1863 and one in 1864. Now we have to remember, he gave these proclamations literally in the middle of and at the end of his ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies of making room for the Transcontinental Railway. He was literally in the process of removing the Dakota Winnebago, slaughtering the Shoshone, slaughtering the Cheyenne Arapaho, and torturing and bringing to death camps the Navajo and Mescalero Apache. And in the middle and at the end of that process, this is what he said. In his Thanksgiving Day Proclamation in 1863, Abraham Lincoln said, "Needful diversions of wealth and of strength from the fields of peaceful industry to the national defense have not arrested the plow, the shuttle, or the ship. The axe has enlarged our borders and of our settlements, and the mines, as well as of iron and coal, as of the precious metals, have yielded even more abundantly than heretofore. Population has steadily increased, notwithstanding there was the waste that has been made in the camp, the siege, and the battlefield, and the country, rejoicing in the consciousness of augmented strength and vigor, is permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the Most High God." In 1863, after the hanging of the Dakota 38, after the massacre at Bear River of the Shoshone, after the removal of the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, and literally while he is ethnically cleansing the territories of Arizona and New Mexico, Abraham Lincoln is calling for a national day of thanksgiving to give thanks to the Lord Most High for the fruits of the genocide that he was actively committing. In 1864, he said, "It has pleased Almighty God to prolong our national life another year. He has opened us to new sources of wealth and has crowned the labor of our working men in every department of industry with abundant rewards. Moreover, he has been pleased to animate and inspire our minds and hearts with fortitude, courage, and resolution sufficient for the great trial of civil war into which we have been brought by our adherence as a nation to the cause of freedom and humanity, and to afford to us reasonable hopes of an ultimate and happy deliverance from all of our dangers and afflictions." Again, this nation he was building did not include people of color. Yes, he ended chattel slavery, but he did not see Black people as citizens. And he was literally ethnically cleansing Native peoples. He's giving thanks, calling for national days of thanksgiving for the white supremacist institutions and nations that he was building, and giving thanks for the genocide that he was committing. This is the Lincoln Memorial, probably the grandest of all memorials in our nation's capital. Again, modeled after a temple. Its size is awe-inspiring. Walking in feels like you're walking onto holy ground. Now, most people are not aware, but if you look down at the bottom of the museum, just to the left-hand side of the stairs that are there, there's a small door. You can't even see it. It's behind the bushes. You just see a little sign above it. That's the door to the bathroom, as well as to the museum. There's a small museum at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, remember, the Lincoln Memorial is the site where we've had countless protests, speeches, right? Martin Luther King gave a speech there. people of color have gathered on the steps of this memorial, trying to claim their rights, our rights as citizens. But if you go into this museum, the base of the memorial, on your way to the bathroom, you will find that there's a wall, and this museum is small. It's about the size of a large classroom. On each wall, there are plaques. They're marble. They're about 3 feet, 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide. Etched in stone of these marble plaques are different quotes and sayings by Abraham Lincoln about different parts of his legacy. On one wall are these 5 plaques with his thoughts on the Union. And in the middle of that wall is this plaque with his white supremacist statement responding to Horace Greeley. I would save the Union. My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. It is not to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So not only did Abraham Lincoln clearly state that he didn't give a crap about Black lives, not only did Abraham Lincoln clearly state he was not doing this for the humanity or the value of Black people, but our nation decided that this white supremacist vile rhetoric was worth honoring at the temple they were building to honor this vile white supremacist, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal president. So if you go to Lincoln Memorial, you can literally find in this temple a plaque clearly stating, according to Abraham Lincoln and the people in charge of this country, Black lives don't matter. So yeah, this bottom comparison may be hard to stomach, but it's absolutely true. Imagine what Nazi Germany would look like had they won their war, and what they would be saying today about Jewish people. Just imagine what they would choose to honor, what they would put up, what quotes they would highlight. Imagine what their history would look like had they won their war. And actually, you don't have to imagine it, because it would probably look very similar to what the United States of America looks like today, and its regard not only for African people, but for Native peoples and other people of color. This is why, my relatives, I absolutely believe the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. Something on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would not even dream about calling ours Truth and Reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which is absolutely false. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, and this is an old slide. I should have changed it. My goal was 2021. That's why I ran for president in 2020. But that's also why I'm working today, giving these speeches, engaging these conversations, writing the books I've written, giving the videos that I'm putting out there. I'm trying my hardest, even though I'm not running for office right now, to try to engage this national dialogue, because we absolutely need to have it. We honor vile and genocidal men. We build temples to them, and we mock people of color by the quotes we put from them in the monuments that we've built. We have to do better, my relatives. We have to do better. So while I am grateful that Joe Biden, Vice President Harris, Secretary Deb Haaland, over the weekend remembered and acknowledged our history, our vile history of internment camps. I'm deeply, deeply disappointed. They are not saying a word about one of the men that we are choosing to honor today as a nation. We can do better, my relatives. This quote that was used by George Erasmus when he was talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. The quote that says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where communities to be formed, their common memory must be created. I so deeply believe in this. We have to teach an accurate common memory. We have to acknowledge our past. We have to acknowledge what we're standing on. We have to acknowledge what we've done and are continuing to do, because if we don't, not only do we look like fools, but we're never going to have a healthy community. We're never going to be a healthy nation. We're never going to be able to be a country where we, the people, actually means all the people. That was not the vision of our founding fathers. That was not the vision of Abraham Lincoln. And it's actually not the vision of most of our political leaders today. Because if it was, they would be giving speeches, much like I'm giving to you today. Not to shame people, not to vilify people, but to teach a common memory and to work at the very foundational levels towards a healthier community. I want to thank you, my relatives, for joining me today. I know that this is a harder speech to hear, and it's a harder challenge to hear, but it's something that I think we absolutely need to be working on as a country. And so I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to encourage you to continue to study this history. If you like, I welcome you to order this book, Unsettling Truths. If you want to engage with what I'm doing and the work I'm doing, you can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I'm even on Twitch and TikTok, although I'm not on those two as frequently. I also just started a site on Patreon a few weeks ago, and so you can find me there as well. But I encourage you to continue to work with me to press this conversation forward. We need this national dialogue on race, gender, and class, and we need to create this common memory. I want to thank everybody who joined me today. I don't, because we've been on for over an hour, I'm not going to have time to go through all the comments right now, but I will definitely read them after this presentation is over, and I will try to address any questions that come up during my second cups of coffee this next week. So yeah, I hope that you'll join me for that. I try to do a second cup of coffee several times a week on my social media. And so if you wrote a question in here, I will go through and try to pull it out so that I can answer it later. Or you can always reach out to me over social media, and I'm happy to try to engage this as well. So yeah, my relatives, walk in beauty. And may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakonet.